Hello, today I'd like to show you some basics of foundation piecing. So here I've pieced a tree, I'm sure it's a tree, using basic foundation piecing method of sewing onto a foundation, which is why it's called foundation piecing. We sew onto a foundation, and today I've used paper as my foundation. So this is what I've used for my pattern and foundation, and the idea of this is because we're sewing some difficult angles that would be hard to cut and piece on the regular system of squares and triangles and things. When you sew onto a foundation, you can get a very accurate finish using the foundation. It is a little bit tricky because you're kind of working back to front. So this is a very simple form of foundation piecing. It can be taken into much more complicated areas and very detailed design. But today we're just going to make a little simple tree. So I have printed this pattern out from my computer through a nice quilting software program that I have, and it's printed for foundation piecing. So what that means is that the shapes that make up the pattern are actually numbered, and they're numbered in the order that you would place the fabric on. So number 1 is actually the tree trunk, so we're going to start with that, and then we're going to start putting on some background. This is number 2, this is number 3. So these are our backgrounds, as you can see here with the tree. We're going to start with the trunk, and then the background's down here. Then number 4 is going to be the tree, the green, and then we've got 2 more background pieces. So the background pieces I've used all the same fabric, but obviously different colours for the tree trunk and the tree. So the numbering is there to help you know which order to put things into. As well as that, outside the pattern there's a fainter line that you may not be able to see there, that's 1/4 of an inch away from that darker line. So the heavy line that is at the edge of the block is the finished block size, and this other fainter line is the cutting line. When we finish, I'll show you how we're going to trim it up on that cutting line, which is your 1/4 inch distance away for your seam allowance. So to get started, I have cut some fabrics ready. So for something like this that's fairly simple shapes, I always like to cut my fabrics a little bit larger than I need them. So this is going to be my tree trunk, and you can see that it's a little bit bigger all round. It certainly needs to be at least 1/4 of an inch bigger than your actual shape, because that will be your seam allowance. You've got to imagine, even though you're sewing it to paper, that you're actually joining the pieces together with a regular seam allowance, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we're actually going to be sewing on the line, but we're going to be placing the fabric on this side. So the paper is on the back side of the block. So like I've got a block done here to show you that. This is a tree, and on the back side is the pattern that we're using. Well, this is a smaller one, but so you can see all the pattern on the back side. So that's the lines that we'll be sewing on. This side is the right side, so that they're wrong sides together, if you like. The wrong side of the paper will be to the wrong side of the fabric. So to get started, we're going to put this on here. So it's quite helpful to have some sort of light source if you have a light box handy, but I've just got my sewing lamp here. If I just hold this up, I can see more or less where to put that. And just that first one, I'm just going to pop a little dab of glue. Now, only a dab. You don't want to have it a heavy glue, you don't want it sticking hard. It's just really to hold it while we get sewing. So I've got a little dab of glue there, and I'm just going to check. I'm not sure whether you can see this. If you hold that up to the light, you can see that there's fabric either side of the lines that we're going to be sewing on. So that's a really good result. So you've got the right side of the fabric showing on this side, and now I'm going to lay on top of that my next piece of fabric. Now, because I know that this is approximately 1/4 of an inch over the line, it's about right to line up the edge of this piece. These have all been cut a little bit larger than the finished sizes. Now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. You may want to pop a pin in that. I'm not very good with pins. So I'm just going to hold that and take that to the sewing machine, and I'm now going to sew on this line here. Now on the sewing machine, I'm just using a straight stitch, but a smaller stitch than normal. So if your stitch length normally is 2.5, the machines vary a little bit, but if it's normally 2.5, I've taken mine down to 1.5. The reason for the smaller stitch is that it perforates the paper better, so that it's easier to tear away, because we will be taking the paper out afterwards. So I'm going to stitch now on that line, and I'm starting right out from the edge beyond the seam allowance area, and I'm just going to go 1/4 of an inch beyond into the tree area with my stitching. So just a straight line on that line, starting out beyond the seam allowance area. And here just 2 or 3 stitches into the tree, just to hold that. And now you can see that that's there, and I also like to press as I go. I find I get a much better result. So I'm just going to just press that over so that that sits nicely there. Now I'm going to come back and put the next shape on. Again, because I know that my seam allowance is about right. It doesn't have to be exact because we're sewing on the line rather than using the edge of the fabric. And I'm going to sew that line now. Same thing, start out in beyond the seam allowance area and sew a straight line up. So you can see that that's there, and back to press again. And flip that over and just gently push that over. So there's our tree trunk set in amongst its background there. So now I'm going to put the tree on. Now I've got some little owls in my tree this time. Now when I look through the light, again I can see that my seam, that the fabric beyond the seam line is considerably more than I need for a normal 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I could trim it off now, but I'm not going to. I'm going to bring this here. Now because we're working on the other side of the paper to where we're sewing, it's a bit harder to see, but we know that this tree is going to be sewing here and flipping up here, so we need to make sure it's going to fit within our area. So again, I would probably use the light source, and again you may want to use some pins to hold this. And I can still see through, even though that's now a double layer, where that green is sitting. So you want it to sit fairly straight, so try and keep it parallel with your sewing line so that it flips up straight. And now I'm going to sew along that line. Pins are quite a good idea. I just find that I wear them more than I use them. So now I'm just stitching again, starting out beyond the seam allowance area and right the way across. So you're always sewing with your fabrics right sides together, just as you would normally on a project, except that you're sewing through the paper as well. Okay, and now I'd like to trim that seam allowance back. So I'm just going to pull on that just till I can, it doesn't really matter if you rip that little bit of paper there, so that I can fold that out the way along the sewing line. And I'm just going to trim that off. And so I'm going to line my ruler up and trim it back to approximately 1/4 of an inch. Just get rid of those bits, because that's just extra bulk that would sit in behind the block, and you don't really need that there. And now back to the iron to iron that line. These owls in this tree are so cute. So here I have my tree, but now it needs a little bit of shape, so we've got to put these diagonal bits on. Now when you're cutting pieces of fabric for the diagonal bits, you need to allow, when you sew this on, you're going to be sewing it this way. This is the sewing line, so this is just how you can check how much fabric you need. You can just lay a strip on it's got to extend beyond here, and it's got to extend beyond here, and it has to also be able to flip right over and on that line there and cover completely where the pattern is, including the seam allowance. So you need to make sure that that's wide enough to do that whole turnover thing there. That's probably an area that can be a little bit tricky. It also does mean, because we're sewing it in that manner, that our edges are not going to be on the straight grain. So that's something that you'll have to be aware of when you're using the block, when you're piecing it with something else. But for now, I'm going to pop this border on, and I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to look at the light. I'm going to make sure that my fabric's extending beyond at both edges, at both ends, and I only want that 1/4 inch. Can you see that? And so I'm going to sew along that diagonal line there. Same thing, start out beyond the 1/4 inch seam area and all the way down. And when you get down here, continue on right on the same angle right through into the seam allowance area till you've gone beyond the seam allowance. And I can just make sure that's going to work, and yes, it's definitely going to come over far enough for my block. But now I want to trim that off like we did with that other seam, and because that's sewn down, I'm just going to pull that little bit of paper back there. Then I can fold that out the way. There's other things you can do, there's other ways of doing foundation piecing, but this is a simple basic method, just using paper. Regular printing paper is a bit heavy, it's harder to tear away at the end, but it's not impossible to use, as you can see. So now that's going to flip over there, so I'm going to go back to my iron and iron that over. And there's just one more piece to go on now, so the other diagonal. Now just looking at it, I know that it's roughly going to go around about here, but again I need to take it up to my light source and just make sure that it's sitting pretty much in the right place. So this can seem a little bit wasteful because we will be trimming away some of these areas. Sometimes there's big enough bits for you to reuse in some other project, and sometimes it's just the way it is. Okay, so starting way beyond in the seam allowance area and coming right up, following that line. Very carried away making these blocks up. I've made just a little forest today, really. Okay, so same thing, I want to trim back that seam allowance, so I'm just going to rip that little bit back from the paper, fold that, and you may have to do the same at the top there. Fold that paper along that sewing line just to get it out the way. And we're going to just trim that 1/4 inch from the sewing line. And back to the iron. So we now have a very strange looking block, but it looks like there's a tree in there somewhere. So now what we have to do is just trim it. So on this side there's this line that's 1/4 inch away from the finish line, and so we just need to trim it on that line now. Just with your ruler, right along that line on all 4 sides, just using the pattern as your guide. And all of a sudden that looks way more like a tree block. So this is the same size as this one that I had made previously. This one's had the papers removed, this one obviously still hasn't. So to remove the papers, all we need to do, because you've got that nice smaller stitch that's perforated the paper quite nicely, and now we just need to tear that away. So what you don't want is to be ripping at it if it's too hard. If it's not coming away nicely, I can show you a way of making that a little bit easier. And because you don't want to be ripping away at your stitches. So if it's not coming away nicely for some reason, just a little bottle of water that you can spray with, just a little bit of spray on there, a bit of dampness softens the paper, and you'll find it comes away amazingly easier. And as well as that, if you were doing something a little bit more complicated, where things get stuck in corners and little bits and pieces, if they won't come away, same thing, you can spray it with some water, and then you can use a little quick unpick to help pick things out of corners if they get stuck. I don't think we're going to get stuck today because it's behaving very nicely. But this is a very simple shape. It's when you get much more fiddly points and things that you can have problems with things like that. But there are papers available that are lighter weight. You can also use wash away fabric, so you don't have to do all this tearing away. But you mustn't spray the wash away fabric, of course, because as soon as it gets wet it disintegrates. And so that's all pulled off now. You don't need the paper, you can't reuse it because it's all ripped up. And there's our tree block. And so today I did get a little bit carried away with making a little forest. I have a variety of sizes, even down to just a little tree. A stripy tree. I don't know if I've ever seen a stripy tree, but it looked quite fun at the time. So by making them different sizes, if you were wanting to use them more or less in a row, you could add on another piece of fabric to bring them all up to the same height of your background fabric or something, or you may have some completely different idea, or you may not even want to make a tree. But that's how I've done the basic foundation piecing. I hope that's helpful, and thank you very much.